This evening I would like to speak to you about the obstacles to the spiritual life. And here I'm addressing those who are in the church, or at least in and around the church. This is not a talk which is addressed to atheists, for fairly obvious reasons, I think. This is not a talk which is addressed to people who are perhaps not atheists, but who are outside of the church. Specifically, I have isolated a number of obstacles to spiritual growth, to the spiritual life. We'll speak about several this evening for those who are attempting to live a spiritual life, who believe in God, who accept the faith of the church, and who are trying to live a life, at least to some extent, in the church. The first obstacle that I would like to identify, and in each case I will break them down into several parts, is sloth, or I have actually put two here under one category, sloth and akedia. I'm using the word in Greek because there is no English translation. We have not succeeded in coming up with one accurate translation for this word, akedia. Sloth, I think we all understand. Akedia needs to be unpacked, and it can be translated by a number of words in English. Listlessness is one of them. A kind of spiritual boredom, although boredom on its own would not be a good translation. Melancholy. If you put all of those things together, it would give you a sense of what akedia is. It's a temptation in which you feel uneasy and somewhat despondent, hopeless a little bit about the spiritual life, and driven to make sudden changes or moves. That's akedia. I've identified it as at the very beginning, because I think it is very, very common. It's something that affects all Christians. So I haven't placed these in an order of ascent in some way, but I've put this at the beginning just because it is something that you and I are going to fight with all the time. Sloth and akedia. They're not exactly the same thing, but they are related. But perhaps we need to distinguish both of them, disambiguate, so to speak, the two from fatigue. Fatigue. It's possible for us to be simply tired. When we're tired, it occurs because we are human. Perhaps we didn't rest well enough, we're worn out, or perhaps we are fatigued from complexity. I'm going to talk about that a little later. But we are tired. When we are tired, we need to rest. It doesn't mean that we are experiencing sloth, although it could potentially be an opening to sloth. It doesn't mean that fatigue and sloth are the same thing. The Lord, after all, was tired, but he did not experience sloth or akedia the way we would. He was tempted, but when I say did not experience, he did not give in. He did certainly experience fatigue, that is for sure. So I will define for this evening sloth as a choice not to act. We probably don't think of sloth as a choice. We probably think of it as the absence of choice. But in fact, sloth in reality is a choice. It's a choice not to act. That, you see, is a choice. Even when you're not doing something, that also is a choice. And when we choose not to act, when we know what all of the ramifications are in the spiritual life, we are likely suffering from sloth. But we could also be tempted by akedia, which is something different. As I mentioned, akedia is a kind of a temptation in which we feel restless. I've described it as a restless, quiet rebellion. It's a kind of rebellion in the spiritual life because there's a dissatisfaction connected with it. As I mentioned, akedia prompts us to give up on one thing and to try another. Spiritually speaking, to be always on the move. When we read about it in classic spiritual texts in the Orthodox Church, most of them, of course, are monastic texts, we read about monks who are tempted to abandon their cell, to abandon their rule, to find another monastery, to get a better place, to find a better spiritual father. And the list, of course, goes on and on and on, with the temptation being that if you do these things, things are going to be better. And of course, we discover very quickly that the vast majority of times we are not experiencing any kind of improvement. This kind of temptation is, as I mentioned, very, very common, and we need help in identifying it because it takes us away if we give in. It's not to say that we give in. You know, we can experience it and be tempted by it and not give in. That's possible. But if we do give in, it exhausts us even more because we've made a move unnecessarily. We've changed something when we ought to have simply stayed with what we already had. The second thing that I would like to speak about this evening is the failure to exercise control on our thoughts. Notice I didn't say failure to eliminate thoughts, because I don't think we can do that, and I don't think it's normal for a human being to eliminate all thoughts. But we need to be very much aware of the thoughts that we have, and we need to exercise some kind of control over them. We can't exercise any choice over whether or not thoughts appear, because they're going to appear. So the area in which you and I have choice is whether or not we want to dialogue with them, whether or not we find them interesting, whether or not we find a thought intriguing enough to enter into relationship with it. And when I say enter into relationship with, this is exactly the word that the fathers of the church use. They use the word coupling, to couple, to enter into relationship with a thought. When they're speaking about it, they're speaking specifically about a sinful thought. But of course, we have all kinds of thoughts, not all of them sinful, but some of them useless. Some thoughts associated with fantasy. Others are more explicitly sinful. They are judgmental. They are proud or provoke a subtle kind of arrogance. They're violent. They are lustful. And so we understand right away that this is the primary battleground for most Christians. This is where we are waging war, so to speak. It's in the thought world. Sometimes we make deliberate choices to entertain a thought because we want to. We would like to. Sometimes we are addicted. We have a passion and we're addicted to it. We think we're making a choice, but actually we've passed beyond the realm of choice anymore. We're so attached to a particular thought or passion that it is functioning on its own as a kind of addiction. And interestingly enough, the fathers use that word, use a word which in Greek essentially means addiction. Sometimes these thoughts are compulsive. They could be compulsive because some of us are more or less compulsive than others. It's simply a question of establishing a scale, you know. It's not a question of trying to find a person who is very compulsive and people who are not compulsive at all. In some cases, of course, for people it can be a kind of illness which requires treatment, and it does in fact have a huge impact on the spiritual life. And so it's very important in that case to seek out treatment for intrusive and compulsive thoughts. So if we were to go back over these different categories of thoughts, we might say that one category represents a choice, another category represents a form of enslavement, that's the addiction, and the compulsive thoughts may or may not be a kind of illness. The critical part is that when we are invaded by thoughts, we are being exhausted by them. It's not to say that we are to stop thinking and that we ought not to be creative and ought not to exercise our creative faculties. Quite on the contrary, we ought to do this. But we certainly need to stop dialoguing with passionate and sinful thoughts, and by passionate I'm not using this strictly in a sexual sense, but in the sense of all of the passions. And certainly we need to know that many thoughts that do not appear sinful nevertheless become distractions to the spiritual life. And in fact, all of these thoughts, when they are uncontrolled, make it virtually impossible to pray, make it enormously difficult to pray. And if it becomes enormously difficult to pray, people are tempted to give up on it. And of course, when we give up on prayer, we cannot have a spiritual life. So at the beginning, this may seem like something desirable, but once we understand the importance of controlling thoughts, the importance of being vigilant with our thoughts, we see that this is absolutely critical. It's absolutely critical to have a spiritual life. And the failure to exercise some kind of control over thoughts is one of the major obstacles to the spiritual life. Thirdly, self-love, philautia. How much the fathers of the church speak about this one. This is one of the primary threats to the spiritual life. We need to unpack it a bit to understand what it means. When we speak about self-love, we are talking about an indulging of the pathological self, or, if you like it better, a pathological indulging of the self. Depends where you would like to put the word pathological or wrong. When we are talking about self-love as an obstacle to the spiritual life, it doesn't mean that self-loathing would be the antidote. It's not the opposite. Self-love is connected with, if we were to borrow a kind of a term from psychology, a kind of narcissistic preoccupation with self. And it's very deadly in the spiritual life because it presents in all kinds of very subtle ways. And they are usually so subtle that it becomes virtually impossible for us at a particular moment to say, I'm suffering from philautia, from self-love. Rather, we see the results. We see the symptoms. It's like an illness, a virus or an illness that is growing within, and one can't identify it until the symptoms begin to appear. And from the symptoms, a practitioner is able to make an accurate diagnosis of the original cause. The same with self-love. The symptoms are manifold, but what we see is that self-love causes us to break our communion with others. Self-love, not surprisingly, prevents the acquisition of humility. And this is bad news, because the fathers of the Church tell us that humility operates as the gateway to all of the other virtues. And so the failure to acquire humility is not an inconvenient detail in the spiritual life. It stops the spiritual life. It's a serious problem. Self-love taints, and I think taints is the right word, prayer. We see in the way that the Pharisee prays. He has a fair bit of philautia. It puts him out of touch with God, out of touch with his neighbor, in this case the tax collector, and of course out of touch with himself. Someone who has self-love cannot have true spiritual self-awareness. And one of the Desert Fathers tells us that the lack of self-awareness is the root of all sin. And so, it's a serious problem that needs to be addressed. And it shows itself in so many ways. Sometimes in love of money, sometimes self-love can even be projected by us onto our children. So there are many, many ways in which this particular obstacle and temptation manifests itself. I had mentioned complexity earlier and had promised to return to this particular challenge to the spiritual life. And I think for us living in our own time, in Ottawa, in Canada, in North America, in our culture, in this world, this is a major challenge that we need to face. Our daily lives are enormously complex. In many areas, there's not a lot we can do about it. The level of complexity in most jobs is rising. You and I can't control that. It's simply a feature of rapid development of technology and science. But there's a kind of complexity which invades one's whole life, to the point where it becomes enormously difficult to have any kind of real spiritual life at all, unless it's placed in some very limited category, separate from everything else. And the problem with this kind of complexity is that the spiritual life, in and of itself, while sometimes difficult, is always simple, basic. One only needs to read the Gospel to see both how challenging, but how simple and straightforward it is. When we read the words of the Lord, we're struck by their simplicity. It's the simplicity in part, as well as, of course, the spiritual authority that captivated the spiritual hearts of the Lord's hearers. Here is someone who spoke and who speaks wisely, with authority, with power, and yet with great simplicity. When we are over-programmed in our daily lives, and let's face it, if we don't do anything about it, by default, we will be over-programmed. It won't be that you and I sit down and decide to be over-programmed. We will simply become over-programmed if we don't do something about it. When we're overprogrammed, the mind is flooded with thoughts. Flooded, inundated with thoughts. Producing a kind of exhaustion, a physical exhaustion in many people, but also a spiritual exhaustion. And of course, all of this competes with not just time. You and I think it can be reduced to time, as if scheduling were the answer to everything. It competes with availability. It isn't just that I might need to set 15 minutes aside to pray. That is relatively easy, and most of us who've survived complexity have learned the art of scheduling. But that isn't to say that in that 15 minutes that I'm available for prayer. That is a completely different story. And likely if I haven't done something deliberate with the complexity in my life, my level of availability will be extremely low. My level of fatigue will be extremely high. And my level of frustration and hopelessness about the spiritual life will be very much present in everything that I do. When we don't combat complexity, we fail to take on simple, basic Christian disciplines, the ones that the Lord talks about in the gospel: prayer, fasting, obeying the commandments. These simple things really are basic to the spiritual life. And when we don't do them, we suffer.